Picture this: the vast, open sea under a blazing sun, where the creak of wooden hulls and the shouts of sailors carried the weight of empires. Ancient naval warfare wasn't just about who had the biggest ships or the sharpest swords. It was a high-stakes game of strategy, where every move could mean victory or ruin. Think of it as the ultimate chessboard, but with waves crashing against the hulls and the fate of entire civilizations hanging in the balance. From the cunning tactics of the Phoenicians to the relentless ambition of Rome, the struggle for control of the seas shaped the course of history in ways that still echo today. What made these ancient fleets so formidable? It wasn't just the strength of their oars or the size of their sails. It was the minds behind them. Naval commanders had to be master tacticians, diplomats, and even psychologists, outmaneuvering their enemies, not just on the water, but in the shadows of political intrigue. A single battle could shift the balance of power, toppling kings and rewriting maps, and the secrets of their success, they're more fascinating than you might think. Hidden in the annals of history are stories of deception, innovation, and sheer audacity that would put even the most daring modern strategists to shame. So why does this matter to us today? Because these ancient struggles reveal something timeless about human ambition and ingenuity. The same drive to conquer, to outthink, and to adapt still fuels our world, just in different forms. As we dive into the tactics and power plays of ancient naval warfare, you'll see how these battles weren't just about who controlled the seas, but who shaped the future. Get ready to uncover the hidden layers of history, where every wave tells a story and every strategy holds a lesson. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a glimpse into the minds that changed the world. The story of naval warfare begins not with empires clashing on the open ocean, but along the quiet riverbanks of ancient civilizations. As far back as 3,000 years before the Common Era, the Egyptians were already mastering the Nile with sleek wooden vessels, crafts that could carry goods one day and warriors the next. But the real turning point came when these early cultures realized ships weren't just for transport, they were floating fortresses, capable of projecting power farther than any army marching on land. The Minoans of Crete took this idea even further, their agile fleets patrolling the Aegean like wolves guarding their territory, turning the sea itself into a battleground. Then came the first great naval clash in recorded history, a desperate struggle between Pharaoh Ramses III and the enigmatic Sea Peoples, a shadowy coalition of raiders who threatened to drown Egypt in chaos. Picture the scene: the Nile Delta choked with ships, flaming arrows arcing through the smoke-filled sky, the fate of a civilization resting on who controlled the waves. This wasn't just a battle, it was a revelation. Suddenly, every king and conqueror understood that mastery of the water meant mastery of destiny. But the true revolution came with the Greeks and their triremes, sleek, deadly machines of war powered by 3 tiers of rowers. These weren't just boats, they were precision instruments of strategy, capable of razor-sharp maneuvers like the Decoding, a daring oar-powered charge to shear off enemy oars, or the Periplus, a flanking move that turned naval battles into aquatic chess matches. What made these ships so transformative wasn't just their speed or strength, it was how they forced commanders to think differently. Naval warfare stopped being about brute force and started being about geometry, timing, and psychological warfare. And here's the fascinating part: these innovations didn't stay locked in the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, those master traders and navigators, took these lessons and wove them into a web of commerce and control that stretched from Tyre to Carthage. Their ships became the veins of empire, carrying not just soldiers but ideas, the blueprint for how sea power could build civilizations. When Rome finally crushed Carthage in the Punic Wars, it wasn't just a victory of legions, it was the triumph of a navy that had learned every lesson the ancient world could teach. So why does this matter? Because every empire that ever ruled the waves, from Athens to Venice to the British, stood on the shoulders of these early pioneers. The Triremes' oar strokes echo in the engines of modern warships, and Ramses' struggle against the sea peoples still whispers a warning: ignore the sea, and the sea will decide your fate. Geography shaped naval power like a sculptor molds clay. It determined who ruled the waves and who watched from the shore. Take the Phoenicians, nestled along the narrow coastal strip of modern-day Lebanon. Their cities, like Tyre and Sidon, weren't just ports, they were launch pads for empire. With the Mediterranean at their doorstep, they turned geography into destiny, their ships darting between coves and headlands like threads weaving a vast commercial web. The sea wasn't a barrier for them, it was a highway, and their mastery of its currents and winds made them the undisputed traders and tacticians of the ancient world. But contrast that with the Hittites, an inland powerhouse whose armies could shake mountains yet faltered at the water's edge. Without natural harbors or easy access to open waters, their ambitions drowned in logistical nightmares. Imagine a lion, fierce on land but helpless in the surf. That was the fate of landlocked empires. Geography didn't just favor some civilizations, it chose them, elevating those who could read the waves like a map and punishing those who couldn't. Then there were the Greeks, scattered across 1,000 islands like pieces of a puzzle. For them, the sea wasn't just a resource, it was a lifeline. Every rocky outcrop demanded a ship, every narrow strait a strategy. Their geography bred innovation. How do you defend an empire when your cities are divided by water? The answer was the trireme, a floating fortress that turned the Aegean into a Greek lake. Control the islands, and you controlled the trade routes, the food supply, the very pulse of the region. And let's not forget the choke points, those narrow passages where geography became a weapon. The Dardanelles, for instance, wasn't just a strait, it was a turnstile for history. Whoever held it could strangle entire economies or unleash fleets like a cork from a bottle. The Peloponnesian War showed this brutally when Sparta allied with Persia to choke Athenian grain shipments. The mighty Athens starved. No army, no wall, no speech could change that. Geography whispered the rules and the wise listened. Here's the kicker, these ancient lessons still ripple through time. Today's naval powers, whether guarding the Strait of Hormuz or the South China Sea, are playing the same game on a bigger map. The names change, the ships grow steel hulls, but the truth remains. If you don't respect geography, it will humble you. The Phoenicians knew it, the Greeks weaponized it. And every empire since has risen or fallen by the same unyielding law. The sea rewards only those who understand its language. The trireme wasn't just a ship, it was a revolution on the water. Imagine a vessel so finely tuned for war that it could slice through waves like a blade. Its 3 tiers of oars moving in perfect unison, powered by the sweat and discipline of nearly 200 rowers. This wasn't just engineering, it was artistry in motion. The Greeks didn't just build these ships, they orchestrated them, turning naval battles into ballets of precision and chaos. And nothing proved their brilliance more than the Battle of Salamis in 480 before the Common Era, where a handful of Greek triremes faced down the colossal Persian fleet and won. What made the trireme so deadly? It wasn't just the raw muscle of its rowers, though that was crucial. It was the way every element worked together. the shallow draft that let it glide into tight spaces, the bronze-clad ram at its prow ready to splinter enemy hulls, the sudden bursts of speed that could turn a retreat into a lethal charge. These ships didn't just fight, they danced, executing maneuvers like the Decoding, where they'd slip between enemy lines, shearing oars and leaving chaos in their wake. Or the Periplus, a flanking move so swift it left opponents disoriented, their formations crumbling before they could react. But here's the twist: triremes were as fragile as they were fierce. Built for speed, not endurance, they were like racehorses, powerful in short bursts but useless without trained crews. A single battle could exhaust a fleet's rowers, and replacing them wasn't as simple as recruiting more soldiers. These weren't just laborers, they were specialists, often free citizens who trained for years to sync their strokes with the rhythm of war. Lose too many, and your naval supremacy evaporated overnight. That's why Athens, at its height, maintained a staggering fleet of over 200 triremes, not just to project power, but to preserve it. The Persians learned this the hard way at Salamis. Their ships were heavier, their numbers overwhelming, but they lacked the agility and coordination of the Greeks. When the narrow straits forced them into a chaotic crush, the triremes struck like vipers, exploiting every gap, every moment of hesitation. It wasn't just a victory, it was a masterclass in how technology, terrain, and training could defy brute force, and the ripple effects, they reshaped the Mediterranean. Suddenly, every coastal city needed triremes to compete, sparking an arms race that fueled innovation and desperation in equal measure. The Phoenicians adapted their designs, Carthage expanded its fleets, and Rome, once a land power, would eventually borrow these lessons to dominate the seas. The trireme didn't just win battles, it changed the rules, proving that in naval warfare, speed and skill could outmatch sheer numbers. Centuries later, its legacy lives on in the stealth and strategy of modern navies, a reminder that the best weapons aren't just tools, they're extensions of human ingenuity. Ramming wasn't just a tactic, it was a high-stakes ballet of destruction, where a single moment's hesitation could mean the difference between glory and disaster. Picture a trireme slicing through the waves, its bronze ram gleaming beneath the surface like a predator's fang, zeroing in on the flank of an enemy ship. The goal wasn't just to hit, it was to strike with surgical precision, aiming for the sweet spot where the hull was weakest. A perfect hit could split timber like kindling, sending a vessel to the bottom in seconds. But this wasn't mindless brute force, it was a calculated gamble, demanding split-second timing and flawless teamwork. The Athenians turned ramming into an art form. Their triremes, lighter and nimbler than most, could pivot on a dime, exploiting gaps in enemy formations like a dagger finding flesh. The key was the Decoding, a daring maneuver where ships would weave through opposing lines, dodging rams while positioning for their own lethal strike. It was like a deadly game of chicken, with commanders betting everything on their crew's ability to outthink and outpace the enemy. One misjudged angle, though, and the attacker could find themselves stranded, their own hull impaled on the very ship they'd meant to destroy. But here's what made ramming so psychologically devastating: the noise. Imagine the deafening crunch of wood shattering, the screams of rowers as water rushed in, the sudden tilt of a ship as it began its death plunge. For crews, the terror wasn't just in the impact, it was in the anticipation. Watching an enemy ram close the distance, knowing there was no armor thick enough to stop it, turned even seasoned sailors into panicked men. That's why the best naval commanders, like Athens' Themistocles, didn't just rely on brute strength. They used feints and false retreats to lure enemies into shallow water or tight spaces where their rams became useless. And the risks, they were astronomical. A failed ramming attempt could leave a ship dead in the water, its oars tangled or its prow stuck in the wreckage of its target. That's why backup plans were crucial. Athenian triremes often carried marines' elite fighters who'd board enemy vessels if ramming failed, turning a naval battle into a bloody melee. But boarding was Plan B for a reason. It was slower, messier, and far less decisive. The real power move was that clean, brutal strike that sank a ship before its crew even knew what hit them. What's fascinating is how this ancient tactic echoes today. Modern torpedoes and missile strikes operate on the same principle: one precise hit to cripple an enemy instantly. The technology has changed, but the psychology remains. Whether it's a trireme's bronze ram or a submarine's silent torpedo, the goal is identical: strike fast, strike hard, and leave no room for recovery. The Athenians understood this instinctively, turning their ships into extensions of their will. In their hands, ramming wasn't just a tactic, it was a statement: control the sea, or the sea will control you. Fire at sea was more than a weapon, it was primal terror unleashed. Imagine the horror of watching flames race across the water toward your ship, knowing there was no escape, no retreat. The Byzantines mastered this fear with Greek fire, a substance so potent it defied logic, burning even as waves crashed against it. The recipe was a state secret, guarded like royal treasure, but its effects were brutally clear. Enemy ships became floating pyres, their crews leaping into the sea rather than face the agony of those clinging flames. What made Greek fire so devastating wasn't just its chemistry, it was the delivery. Byzantine ships mounted brass siphons on their prows, spraying streams of liquid fire with the precision of a dragon's breath. The substance clung to everything it touched: wood, sails, even skin, and water only fed its fury. In the siege of Constantinople in 674, entire Arab fleets vanished into smoke and screams, their numerical advantage meaningless against this infernal technology. The psychological impact was calculated. When rumors spread of Greek fire, some enemies refused to sail at all. But fire didn't require advanced science to be effective. Even simple fire arrows could transform a battle. Picture hundreds of flaming arcs cutting through the night sky, igniting sails and rigging, turning disciplined formations into panicked stampedes. The key was timing: launch too early, and the arrows might fizzle in the wind; too late, and the enemy could counter. Skilled archers soaked arrowheads in pitch or oil, ensuring the flames would linger long enough to sow chaos. Then there were fire ships, the ancient equivalent of a guided missile. Crews would strip down a vessel, pack it with combustibles, point it toward the enemy, and set it adrift. The most infamous use, at the Battle of Red Cliffs in 208, when a coalition of Chinese warlords sent flaming ships careening into the anchored fleet of the mighty Cao Cao. The result wasn't just physical damage, it was total psychological collapse. Sailors who'd faced swords without flinching broke ranks at the sight of an unstoppable wall of fire. Here's the strategic genius behind these tactics. Fire didn't just destroy, it disrupted. Even if a ship didn't burn, the threat forced enemies to scatter, breaking formations that commanders had spent hours perfecting. And in naval warfare, chaos was as deadly as any blade. The Romans knew this when they used firepots, ceramic jars filled with burning oil, to clear paths through enemy lines. The Carthaginians draped wet hides over their ships as makeshift shields, a desperate counter to an unstoppable force. Yet fire was a double-edged sword. Misjudge the wind, and your own fleet could become the target. A botched fire ship attack at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 nearly turned the tide against the Holy League when shifting winds blew flames back toward their allies. Controlling fire demanded not just courage but near superhuman foresight, reading the weather, the currents, the enemy's next move. centuries later, the legacy of these tactics lives on. Modern navies may not hurl firepots, but the principles remain. Dominate through fear, disrupt through unpredictability. Greek fire's descendants are flamethrowers and incendiary bombs, tools that trade mystery for efficiency but still exploit that same human instinct, the dread of being consumed by flames. The Byzantines understood something timeless. In war, the most powerful weapon is often the one that terrifies long before it touches its target. A blockade was more than just ships anchored in a line. It was a silent siege, a war of patience and attrition where hunger proved deadlier than any sword. Take Athens during the Peloponnesian War. Their fleet didn't just patrol the Aegean, they turned it into a noose, choking off Spartan allies like Megara from the grain routes that kept their cities alive. No dramatic battles, no heroic last stands, just the slow, grinding reality of empty storerooms and desperate citizens. The Athenians understood something brutal. Sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a ram or a flame, but a simple question: how long can you last? Maintaining a blockade, though, was like holding a wolf by the ears, exhausting and dangerous. Ships had to remain on constant alert, weathering storms, skirmishes, and the creeping fatigue of crews stretched thin. A single gap in the line could undo months of pressure. When Sparta struck back by seizing the Athenian-held town of Decelia, they didn't just raid farms, they severed Athens' land supply chain, turning the blockade into a two-way stranglehold. The lesson: a navy couldn't just starve its enemy, it had to outlast them. Yet the rewards for success were staggering. Rome's blockade of Carthage during the Third Punic War didn't just weaken the city, it broke an empire. For 3 years, Roman ships circled the harbor, letting disease and desperation do what legions couldn't. By the time the walls fell, Carthage was a shadow of itself, its people hollowed out by hunger. That's the paradox of blockades. They demanded immense resources, but when executed perfectly, they could topple civilizations without the bloodshed of a pitched battle. The real genius lay in the details. Blockading fleets didn't just stop ships, they controlled information. By intercepting messengers, they severed enemies from allies, leaving rulers to guess at threats beyond the horizon. The Venetians perfected this during their wars with Genoa, turning the Adriatic into a locked room where rumors festered and morale crumbled. A well-placed blockade didn't just cut off food, it severed hope. But the risks were equally monumental. A failed blockade could bankrupt a nation. England's continental system under Napoleon drained its treasury, while the Union's Anaconda Plan during the American Civil War required hundreds of ships to patrol thousands of miles of coastline. The math was simple. Blockades were a test of endurance, and the longer they dragged on, the more they exposed the blockaders' own weaknesses. What makes these ancient tactics eerily modern is their psychological dimension. Today's sanctions and trade embargoes operate on the same principled economic pressure, replacing physical barriers, but the goal remains unchanged. Whether it's Athenian triremes circling a port or modern navies monitoring shipping lanes, the message is identical: control the flow of resources, and you control the fate of nations. The blockades of the past remind us that war isn't always fought with steel. Sometimes the quietest strategies echo the loudest. The most devastating weapon in ancient naval warfare wasn't made of wood or bronze, it was fear. Commanders understood that a panicked crew was as good as defeated, and they crafted strategies to exploit that weakness with chilling precision. Take the Carthaginians, who turned retreat into an art of deception. Their fleets would deliberately break formation, feigning disorder to lure overconfident enemies into shallow waters or hidden ambushes. By the time the trap snapped shut, it was too late. The psychological shock of realizing you'd been outthought often crippled morale faster than any ramming strike. Night attacks amplified this terror tenfold. Imagine the horror of Roman sailors hearing oars splashing in the darkness, seeing shadows of enemy ships materialize like ghosts with no time to form a defensive line. The Athenians used this to devastating effect at Syracuse, their sudden assaults under cover of darkness transforming disciplined fleets into disoriented mobs. Without clear visibility, rumors spread like wildfire was that the splash of a trireme or just a wave was the ship next to you, friend or foe. In the chaos, crews often turned on each other, their own fear deadlier than any enemy boarding party. Then there were the false signals, a simple trick with catastrophic consequences. A fleet might raise the flags of a neutral city, slipping past defenses before revealing their true colors at point-blank range. Or they'd mimic distress calls, baiting rivals into abandoning strong positions to chase what seemed like easy prey. The Rhodians were notorious for this, their crippled ships luring enemies into currents or reefs where the real fleet lay waiting. The goal wasn't just to win, it was to make the enemy doubt every sight, every sound, until their own minds became their worst adversaries. Even something as mundane as paint could become a weapon. The Venetians daubed their galleys in garish colors, not for vanity but to unsettle, their vessels' unnatural hues shimmering in the sunlight like sea monsters. Meanwhile, the Byzantines hung iron chains from their prows, the deafening rattle echoing across the water to mimic the sound of an approaching storm. These weren't just tricks, they were symphonies of psychological warfare, each note calculated to unravel an enemy's nerve before the first arrow flew. What's fascinating is how these ancient tactics mirror modern strategies. Today's navies use electronic deception and misinformation, but the principle remains: control the narrative and you control the battle. The Carthaginians knew that victory wasn't just about sinking ships, it was about sinking morale. When a commander could make his enemy question reality, he'd already won half the fight. That's the timeless lesson of naval warfare. The most dangerous battles aren't fought on the water, but in the minds of those who sail it. Keeping a fleet at sea was like feeding a city on the move every day. Thousands of mouths to feed, thousands of oars to mend, and no room for error. The Roman Navy didn't just win battles because of skilled rowers or clever tactics. They won because their supply chains were as disciplined as their legions. Picture the sheer scale. A single trireme required over 400 pounds of grain daily just to keep its rowers strong, not to mention fresh water, spare ropes, and pitch for repairs. Now multiply that by hundreds of ships scattered across hostile waters, and you begin to grasp the miracle of ancient naval logistics. The secret lay in their network of Navalia coastal depots strategically placed like stepping stones across the Mediterranean. These weren't just warehouses, they were lifelines. At places like Misenum and Ravenna, blacksmiths forged replacement anchors, carpenters stockpiled timber, and bakers worked around the clock to produce hardtack that could last for months. The Romans treated supply bases like fortresses, guarding them as fiercely as their ships, because they knew a single raid could unravel months of preparation. When Pompey the Great cleared pirates from the Mediterranean in the 1st century before the Common Era, his real victory wasn't in battles, it was in securing the routes that kept Rome's fleets fed. But the true test came when fleets ventured beyond friendly shores. During the Punic Wars, Rome's invasion of North Africa turned into a logistical nightmare. Ships had to carry not just supplies for the voyage, but enough to sustain armies after landing. The genius solution, a mobile harbor. They'd send ahead cargo ships filled with prefabricated forts and granaries, essentially building supply hubs on enemy beaches. It was like ancient meal prepping on an empire-sized scale. Weather was the wild card that could undo even the best plans. A storm scattering a supply convoy could leave a fleet stranded, forcing sailors to ration sips of vinegar, laced water, or chew on leather to stave off hunger. The Athenians learned this brutally during their Sicilian expedition, when Syracusan raids and bad weather choked off their supply lines. Starvation and disease did more damage than enemy rams. Entire crews perished not from battle wounds, but from dysentery brought on by spoiled rations. What's astonishing is how these ancient systems mirror modern logistics. The Roman annona system, which ensured grain shipments reached the fleet on schedule, operated with a precision rivaling today's just-in-time delivery networks. Their use of standardized amphory-stackable, durable containers marked with contents and origins was the ancient equivalent of barcoding. Even their fraud prevention tactics feel familiar. Officials would seal grain shipments with wax stamps, breaking them only upon delivery to prove no one had tampered with the supplies. The lesson etched into every naval campaign was simple. Battles were won by admirals, but wars were won by quartermasters. When Octavian defeated Mark Antony at Actium, it wasn't just superior tactics that gave him the edge, it was his control of the Adriatic supply routes, which left Antony's fleet demoralized and underfed. Centuries later, the Byzantines would encode this wisdom into their naval manuals, warning commanders that a ship without biscuit is a prison without walls. Logistics didn't just support naval power, they defined it. The empires that mastered the art of moving bread, water, and nails across vast distances didn't just rule the waves, they bent the tides of history to their will. Every trireme that ever won glory did so on a stomach full of someone else's careful planning, proof that the quietest victories often happen far from the roar of battle. Invisible threads of information wove through the ancient seas, as vital to naval supremacy as the strongest hull or sharpest ram. The Athenians didn't just rely on their triremes. They deployed keels, sleek scout ships lighter and faster than anything in battle. Their crews trained to spot enemy sails on the horizon and vanish before being detected. These weren't mere messengers, they were the eyes of the fleet, slipping between islands and coastlines like shadows, turning geography into a living map. When the Persian armada massed near Salamis, it was Athenian scouts who brought the critical warning not just of the enemy's location, but of the perfect bottleneck to trap them. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was the difference between annihilation and immortality. Carthage took a different approach, turning its greatest asset, commerce, into an intelligence network. Their merchants weren't just traders, they were informants, embedding in foreign ports with ears tuned to gossip and eyes on ship movements. A casual conversation about grain shortages in Syracuse or delayed timber shipments to Rhodes could reveal an enemy's readiness for war. The Carthaginians understood that harbors were hives of loose tongues, where drunk sailors and disgruntled dockworkers spilled secrets as easily as wine. By the time their admirals set sail, they already knew which Greek city-states were low on oarsmen, or which Roman allies might waver under pressure. But intelligence gathering wasn't always subtle. The Rhodians elevated deception to an art, painting their scout ships to mimic fishing vessels, their crews disguised in tattered cloaks. They'd linger near enemy anchorages, pretending to mend nets while counting warships and noting troop deployments. One legendary Rhodian captain even staged a drunken brawl in a Sicilian tavern, slurring insults until enemy officers boastfully revealed their fleet's departure time. The next morning, the drunk was back at sea, racing home with a prize more valuable than gold, a timetable for ambush. The Byzantines added cryptography to the mix. Their admirals used coded messages etched onto wax tablets, readable only when scraped with a specific blend of vinegar and soot. A captured courier might carry what appeared to be shopping lists or love letters, while the real orders lay hidden beneath. They even developed an early form of semaphore, with lantern signals from coastal towers relaying fleet movements faster than any ship could sail. In an era without radios, these innovations turned scattered squadrons into a coordinated force, reacting to threats with eerie precision. Yet for all their cunning, ancient intelligence systems had one glaring weakness: time. A scout spotting an enemy fleet at dawn might take hours to report back, and by then the situation could have changed entirely. That's why the greatest commanders paired information with instinct. When Themistocles intercepted Persian plans before Salamis, he didn't just act on them. He baited a trap, using his knowledge of the enemy's arrogance to lure them into the straits. Intelligence wasn't a crystal ball, it was clay to be shaped by strategy. The echoes of these ancient practices resonate today. Modern navies still patrol choke points, still prize satellite imagery over sheer firepower, still wage silent wars of misinformation. The Carthaginian merchant spies would recognize the corporate fronts of contemporary intelligence agencies. The Rhodian disguises mirror today's surveillance drones masquerading as civilian aircraft. What's striking isn't how much has changed, but how much hasn't. The tools have advanced, but the game remains the same. Control the narrative, and you control the waves. Perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in a story from the Punic Wars. As Rome prepared to invade Carthage, they spread rumors of a phantom fleet assembling in Sardinia. Carthage took the bait, diverting ships to defend an empty threat while the real Roman force landed unchallenged near Tunis. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, proving that in naval warfare, the sharpest weapon was never the one you saw coming. It was the lie you believed. The Persian Empire's mighty invasion fleets that threatened Greece weren't crewed by Persians at all. They were powered by the sweat and skill of Phoenician and Egyptian oarsmen, men who had no stake in Persia's wars but every reason to wield their oars for gold. This was the double-edged sword of naval mercenaries, a shortcut to maritime supremacy, but one that could turn against you in the blink of an eye. When Xerxes' fleet faced the Greeks at Salamis, the Phoenician captains weren't just hired hands, they were the backbone of his strategy, their knowledge of Mediterranean currents and coastal hideaways far surpassing anything Persian nobles could muster. Yet that same expertise came with a price. After their crushing defeat, Phoenician ships abandoned the campaign en masse, leaving Xerxes' remaining vessels stranded like prey in a hunter's net. Mercenary fleets transformed naval warfare into a marketplace of loyalty, where the highest bidder could rewrite the balance of power overnight. Carthage, lacking the population to crew its vast navy, turned to Libyan and Iberian rowers, binding them with promises of plunder and citizenship. But when Rome blockaded Carthage during the Mercenary War, those same rowers mutinied, their allegiance evaporating as rations dwindled. The lesson was clear: mercenaries fought for survival, not flags. Even Athens, despite its famed citizen rowers, relied on hired ships from places like Corcyra during the Peloponnesian War, only to watch them flee when Spartan allies raised their pay. Yet the risks couldn't outweigh the rewards for empires stretched thin. Rome's meteoric naval rise during the Punic Wars hinged on copying Carthaginian ship designs and poaching their experienced Greek and Sicilian mercenary pilots. These men didn't just teach Romans how to sail, they revealed Carthage's secret trade routes and storm seasons, turning traitors into the ultimate force multipliers. The Rhodians took a different approach, maintaining a small elite core of citizen sailors, but outsourcing their bulk rowers to seasonal hires from Crete and Cyprus. It was a delicate dance: pay too little and your fleet dissolved, pay too much and you bankrupted your treasury. The most fascinating twist: mercenaries often became cultural bridges, smuggling tactics and technologies across enemy lines. Egyptian sailors who defected to the Persians brought with them knowledge of Nile Delta warfare, while Greek renegades in Persian service introduced Mediterranean ramming techniques to the Red Sea. This wasn't just manpower trading, it was the ancient equivalent of corporate espionage, where every hired oar came with trade secrets attached. But the true legacy of these hired fleets lies in what they reveal about ancient globalization. A Phoenician rower might spend his youth fighting for Tyre, his prime years under Persian wages, and his old age as a mercenary trainer in Carthage, his loyalty as fluid as the tides. The sea didn't just connect empires, it dissolved borders, creating a shadow economy where skill mattered more than citizenship. When Rome finally crushed the pirate stronghold of Cilicia in the 1st century before the Common Era, they weren't just defeating outlaws, they were dismantling a rogue naval network that had supplied mercenaries to everyone from Macedon to Ptolemaic Egypt. In the end, mercenaries embodied the paradox of naval power. You needed outsiders to dominate, but relying on them made dominance fragile. The empires that lasted longest, like Byzantium, learned to blend foreign expertise with unshakable core crews, ensuring that when the gold ran out, the oars kept moving. It's a lesson that echoes in modern conflicts, where private military companies and leased warships continue to blur the lines between national interest and hired muscle. The ancient world understood what we're still grappling with today. On the high seas, loyalty is never just about patriotism. It's about who fills the purse. The Phoenicians didn't just build ships, they sculpted them from the forests of Lebanon, selecting cedar trunks so straight and resilient they seemed gifts from the gods. This wasn't just wood, it was the lifeblood of empires. Cedar resisted rot, repelled worms, and bent with the waves rather than splintering, making it the gold standard of ancient shipbuilding. But securing it meant controlling treacherous mountain passes and fending off rivals desperate for the same resource. The moment a Phoenician shipwright laid hands on a prized cedar log, the clock started ticking. Every day without treatment left the timber vulnerable to warping. Their solution, a secret blend of pine tar and beeswax, boiled in copper cauldrons and brushed onto hulls like liquid armor. The result, ships that could outlast generations, their hulls growing tougher with each year in salt water. Greek shipbuilders took a different approach, turning physics into art. Their triremes weren't just assembled, they were tuned like instruments. The secret lay in the keel, a backbone carved from a single oak trunk, gently curved to slice through waves. But the real genius was in the ribs. Instead of spacing them evenly, Athenian craftsmen clustered them amidships, where stress was greatest, creating a hull that flexed under pressure but never broke. They even adjusted plank thickness based on the ship's roll, thinner for speed in scouts, thicker for brawling in battle lines. And then there was the pitch, a proprietary mix of resin and lime that waterproofed seams while emitting a sulfurous stench to deter barnacles. To modern eyes, it might look like crude workmanship, but every chip of the adze was calculated. A trireme's hull wasn't just wood, it was a mathematical equation disguised as a warship. Rome's naval revolution began with a stroke of luck, a storm washing a Carthaginian quinquereme onto Italian shores. Roman engineers, land-bound for centuries, suddenly had a masterclass in maritime technology laid at their feet. They didn't just copy the design, they reverse-engineered it with brutal efficiency. Where Carthage used intricate joinery, Rome substituted iron nails the length of a man's forearm. Where Phoenicians relied on seasoned timber, Roman shipyards greenwood fresh-cut planks that shrank into watertight seals as they dried. But their real innovation was scale. At the height of the Punic Wars, Rome's shipyards near Naples could launch a fully equipped warship in 60 days, a feat that left Carthaginian spies slack-jawed. How assembly lines centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Teams specialized in single tasks: keel laying, rib setting, ram forging. moving from ship to ship like cogs in a machine. Yet for all their advances, ancient shipbuilders faced one unforgiving limitation: geography. Athens' dominance relied on Attica's silver mines funding timber imports, while Carthage's fate hinged on Sicilian pine forests. When Alexander the Great besieged Tyre, he didn't just attack walls, he severed Phoenicia's access to cedar, strangling their shipyards. The lesson was clear: naval power wasn't just about craftsmanship, it was about controlling the sources of craftsmanship. The Venetians later enshrined this truth, their arsenal not just a shipyard but a guarded ecosystem: forests in Dalmatia reserved for ores, alpine valleys for massed timber, foundries for nails, all within reach. What's astonishing is how these ancient secrets still resonate. Modern engineers studying trireme hulls have found their stress distribution mirrors principles used in today's submarine design. The Roman practice of building ships in prefabricated sections, it's the ancestor of modular ship construction. Even Phoenician anti-fouling pitch finds echoes in modern hull coatings. The ancients may not have understood metallurgy or fluid dynamics, but their trial and error mastery produced floating marvels that ruled the waves for millennia. Behind every naval victory, from Salamis to Actium, lay not just admirals and rowers, but the unsung shipwrights who turned trees into titans. Themistocles didn't just command ships, he orchestrated chaos. At Salamis, with the Persian fleet looming like a storm cloud, he faced a dilemma: how to lure an enemy who outnumbered him 3-1 into a death trap. His solution, a masterstroke of psychological warfare. He sent a trusted slave to Xerxes' camp with a message that the Greek alliance was crumbling, their ships preparing to scatter under cover of darkness. The Persians took the bait, rowing into the narrow straits under the assumption they'd catch a fleeing enemy. Instead, they found triremes coiled like vipers, their rams aimed at the vulnerable flanks of overconfident foes. But Themistocles' brilliance wasn't just in deception, it was in timing. He waited until the morning wind shifted, forcing the Persian ships to tack against the current, their formations unraveling before the first rams struck. This wasn't just a battle plan, it was a symphony of misdirection, geography, and meteorology conducted by a man who knew war wasn't fought on water alone, but in the minds of those who sailed it. Hannibal, though famed for his alpine elephants, revealed an even sharper cunning at sea. During the Punic Wars, his fleet faced a Roman blockade so tight it seemed impenetrable. So he turned their greatest strength against them. Hannibal ordered his ships to load not with extra weapons, but with sacks of snakes, venomous serpents gathered from North African shores. When the Romans closed in to board, his crews hurled the sacks onto enemy decks, transforming battles into scenes of panicked horror. Roman marines, trained to face swords and spears, found themselves slashing at writhing knots of vipers, their discipline shattered by nature's terror. It was a tactic as audacious as it was effective, proving Hannibal understood something fundamental: victory often went to whoever broke the enemy's nerve first. Then there was Agrippa, the architect of Rome's naval dominance. At Actium, where Octavian's future empire hung in the balance, Agrippa didn't just rely on brute force, he reinvented it. His secret weapon, the harpax, a revolutionary grapnel launched from catapults. Unlike traditional boarding hooks, this iron claw couldn't be cut loose. It embedded itself in enemy hulls like a predator's fang, allowing smaller Roman ships to reel in Antony's towering galleys as if they were prize fish. But Agrippa's genius extended beyond gadgets. He drilled his rowers to perfection, their synchronized strokes allowing sudden bursts of speed that left heavier ships floundering. More crucially, he grasped the politics of naval warfare, ensuring his crews were lavishly rewarded and publicly honored, turning rowers often seen as expendable into loyal instruments of his will. What united these commanders wasn't just tactical brilliance, but an intimate understanding of human nature. Themistocles' new arrogance could blind even the mightiest foe. Hannibal recognized fear as a weapon sharper than steel. Agrippa saw that loyalty couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. Their victories weren't just written in battle logs, they were etched into the psychology of their crews. A Greek rower at Salamis didn't just pull an oar, he believed he was part of something divine, inspired by prophecies of victory. A Roman sailor at Actium didn't just man a ballista, he fought for the promise of land and citizenship. These admirals didn't just move ships, they moved men, bending morale like a bowstring before loosing it at the enemy's heart. Their legacies echo far beyond antiquity. Modern naval academies still teach Salamis as the textbook example of asymmetric warfare. Hannibal's snake tactic finds its echo in psychological operations manuals. Agrippa's harpax prefigured the missile systems that dominate today's seas, but perhaps their greatest lesson is timeless. Technology wins battles, but leadership wins wars. The admirals who shaped history didn't just have better ships, they had sharper minds, deeper empathy, and the audacity to rewrite the rules when the old ones failed. In an age when empires rose and fell on the tides, they proved one immutable truth: the sea favors not the strong, but the ingenious. Athens didn't just sail to empire, it mined its way there. The silver veins of Laurion, deep beneath Attica's soil, weren't just a source of wealth, they were the lifeblood of the Athenian navy. Every drachm extracted from those dark tunnels translated into timber from Macedon, rope from Egypt, and the daily wages of 200 rowers per trireme. When the Persians threatened Greece, it was this silver that bankrolled Themistocles' fleet, 200 ships financed not by taxes, but by a literal mountain of ore. The economics were brutal. 1 ton of silver equaled 10 fully crewed warships for a year. Without those mines, Salamis would have been a Persian victory, and Western history might have veered down a very different path. Carthage took a different route to naval supremacy. Their power didn't come from underground, but from across the waves, a sprawling trade network stretching from Spanish tin mines to African gold fields. Every merchant ship paying harbor dues in Carthage's circular ports, every tariff on Sicilian grain or Sardinian copper, fed directly into the shipyards where quinquiremes took shape. Their genius lay in diversification. When one trade route faltered, another could sustain the fleet, but this reliance on commerce also became their Achilles' heel. Rome's blockade during the Punic Wars didn't just target warships, it strangled the flow of silver and ivory that kept Carthage's treasury afloat. No money meant no mercenary rowers, and soon no navy. Smaller players had to get creative. The Delian League, ostensibly an alliance against Persia, quickly became Athens' mechanism for naval cost-sharing. Member states contributed not ships, but tribute silver talents that Athens pooled to build and maintain a centralized fleet. It was ancient collective security with a twist. The weaker allies paid for protection they couldn't provide themselves, while Athens gained an empire disguised as a mutual defense pact. The Rhodians, masters of Mediterranean trade, took another approach. Their navy doubled as a pirate hunting force, with captured vessels auctioned to fund the next season's patrols, a self-sustaining cycle of enforcement and profit. The hidden costs could bankrupt even the wealthiest states. Triremes, though marvels of efficiency, had the lifespan of mayflies' worm-eaten hulls, and sun-rotted ropes required constant replacement. Athens' imperial accounts reveal staggering expenses: 12,000 drachmae annually just to keep a single ship battle-ready, enough to feed 1,000 families for a year. And then there were the rowers, not slaves, as Hollywood might suggest, but well-paid professionals. At the height of the Peloponnesian War, Athens was shelling out a talent of silver daily just in oarsmen's wages. No wonder the treasury reserves were kept under armed guard on the Acropolis. Rome's rise exposed the brutal math of naval economics. After their first disastrous fleet sank in a storm during the Punic Wars, the Senate didn't retreat, they doubled down. The Lex Gabinia of 67 before the Common Era authorized Pompey to raise taxes across the empire specifically to fund anti-piracy squadrons. This wasn't discretionary spending, it was existential investment. The lesson was clear: controlling the Mediterranean meant paying for it upfront, whether through mines like Athens, trade like Carthage, or conquest like Rome. Yet the greatest economic innovation came from Byzantium centuries later. Their solution to naval costs, a state monopoly on shipbuilding materials. By controlling Anatolia's forests and the Black Sea's hemp fields, they turned ship production into a streamlined, taxpayer-subsidized enterprise. The Byzantine dromon fleets didn't just defend the empire, they were the empire, floating manifestations of a centralized economy that could outspend any rival. What does this ancient arithmetic teach us? That naval power was never just about courage or tactics, it was about ledgers. The triremes that ruled the classical world weren't just weapons, they were floating balance sheets, every oar stroke funded by silver, sweat, and shrewd accounting. When Athens' mines played out, their navy faded. When Carthage trade dried up, their ships rotted. And when Rome decided the Mediterranean was worth the price, they opened the treasury and bought an empire. The pattern holds today. The oceans still belong to those who can afford them. Athens didn't stand alone against Persia. It spun a web of alliances as intricate as the rigging on a trireme. The Delian League began as a noble pact, with dozens of Greek city-states pooling ships and silver to keep the Persian menace at bay. But what started as collective security soon twisted into something darker. Smaller members found themselves strong-armed into paying tribute instead of sending ships, their coins flowing to Athens to build a navy that served Athenian ambitions first and Greek freedom second. The League's treasury wasn't just bankrolled by allies, it was guarded on the sacred island of Delos, until even that symbolism wasn't enough. In 454 before the Common Era, Athens moved the funds to the Acropolis, turning alliance into empire with the stroke of a ledger. Rome took a shrewder approach. When they faced Carthage's superior navy in the First Punic War, they didn't just copy enemy ship designs, they copied their network. Greek cities in Sicily, weary of Carthaginian raids, became Rome's eyes and ears, providing harbors for repairs and intelligence on enemy movements. The Rhodian navy, neutral on paper, conveniently lost several ships near Roman fleets, their crews suddenly available for hire. These weren't formal treaties so much as winks and nods, a shadow alliance built on shared enemies rather than shared ideals. By the Third Punic War, Rome had perfected the art, turning Numidian cavalry against Carthage's flanks while Sicilian grain fed Roman legions, a symphony of borrowed strength. Yet for every successful coalition, there were a dozen betrayals. The Peloponnesian War became a revolving door of allegiances where Corinth, Athens' bitter rival, would back Sparta one season and Persia the next. Even the legendary Themistocles, architect of Salamis, ended his days advising Persia against his own people after Athens exiled him. The lesson was brutal but clear. In naval politics, there were no permanent friends, only permanent interests. The most revealing case came during the siege of Syracuse. Athens' grand expedition to Sicily relied on local allies promising easy victories until those same allies melted away as Spartan reinforcements arrived. Without friendly ports to resupply or scout ships to navigate unfamiliar waters, Athens' mighty fleet became trapped like fish in a net, its rowers dying of thirst within sight of the sea. Meanwhile, Sparta, traditionally a land power, proved masterful at naval diplomacy, using Persian gold to build fleets while keeping their hands technically clean. What separated the winners from the losers wasn't just naval skill, it was alliance management. Athens failed because it treated partners as subjects. Rome succeeded because it made even temporary allies feel like stakeholders. The Venetians later enshrined this principle, their navy backed by trading privileges that turned Dalmatian ports and Cretan shipwrights into invested participants rather than conquered territories. The echoes of these ancient power plays resonate today. Modern naval coalitions still grapple with the same tensions: how much sovereignty to sacrifice for security, how to share spoils without breeding resentment. When NATO conducts exercises in the Mediterranean, or when nations patrol the South China Sea in uneasy partnerships, they're walking the same tightrope Athens and Rome once did. The ships may be steel now, but the human calculus remains unchanged. Trust floats all vessels, but suspicion sinks them. The sea was never just water to ancient sailors. It was the domain of capricious gods, a realm where mortal skill meant nothing without divine favor. Greek trireme crews didn't just sharpen their rams before battle. They slaughtered bulls on the prow, their blood swirling into the waves as offerings to Poseidon. The god of the ocean demanded tribute, and no commander dared ignore the rituals. A fleet might have the finest rowers and the sturdiest hulls, but one ignored omen could mean disaster. When the Athenian admiral Cimon prepared to face the Persians at the Battle of the Eurymedon, he didn't just study the enemy's formation. He delayed his attack for days, waiting for the sacred doves at the temple of Aphrodite to signal approval. Victory wasn't just earned, it was granted. Rome took this celestial bargaining even further. Before any fleet set sail, priests scoured the sky for auspices, the flight patterns of birds, the shape of lightning strikes, even the way sacred chickens pecked at their grain. If the omens were unfavorable, the entire campaign could be postponed, no matter how strategically sound the plan. During the First Punic War, a consul famously threw these chickens overboard when they refused to eat, declaring, "If they won't feast, let them drink." His fleet was promptly annihilated in a storm, a lesson etched into Roman naval doctrine: defy the gods at your peril. But religion wasn't just about avoiding wrath, it could be weaponized. The Carthaginians, before engaging the Romans at the Aegates Islands, draped their ships in purple cloth, the color of their sea god Melkart. The sight of an entire fleet shimmering like a divine armada struck terror into enemy crews before the first arrow flew. Similarly, the Byzantines would hoist icons of the Virgin Mary on their masts, convinced her gaze would blind their foes. These weren't mere pageants, they were psychological operations designed to shake an enemy's faith in their own gods. The line between divine intervention and tactical genius often blurred. When a sudden storm scattered the Persian invasion fleet off Mount Athos in 492 before the Common Era, the Greeks didn't credit luck, they saw the hand of Poseidon defending his homeland. The event was so transformative that Xerxes, determined not to repeat the mistake, ordered a canal dug across the peninsula for his next invasion. A staggering engineering feat motivated by superstition as much as strategy. Even the weather was a celestial negotiation. Favorable winds weren't just meteorological phenomena but signs of divine approval. Perhaps the most striking example of faith shaping warfare came during Rome's clash with the pirate king Sextus Pompeius. With his smaller fleet trapped near Sicily, Pompeius's men began chanting to Neptune, their voices carrying across the water. Moments later, a freak wind filled their sails, allowing escape, an event so miraculous that even the pragmatic Roman historian Cassius Dio recorded it as proof of divine favor. The psychological impact was immediate. Pompeius's crews fought like men blessed, while their opponents hesitated, wondering if the gods had truly chosen sides. What makes these ancient beliefs so fascinating isn't just their theatricality, it's their practicality. In an era when storms could sink entire fleets without warning, when navigation relied on stars and guesswork, faith wasn't a crutch, it was a coping mechanism. Rituals gave rowers courage before battle. Omens offered commanders a framework for impossible decisions, and the very unpredictability of the sea reinforced the idea that higher powers were at play. Modern navies may rely on radar and forecasts, but the primal awe of the ocean remains. The ancients understood something we've never fully outgrown. When you venture onto the waves, you're never truly in control. A ship's deck might seem like the last place for democracy, but mutinies proved even the mightiest fleets were only as strong as their crew's loyalty. Take the infamous Athenian disaster in Sicily. What began as a bold campaign unraveled not from enemy spears, but from the simmering rage of oarsmen. After months of stagnant pay, rotten rations, and promises broken by arrogant generals, the fleet reached its breaking point. Rowers, free citizens, not slaves, gathered under the Sicilian moon, debating whether to abandon their commanders entirely. The threat wasn't just lost battles, it was the collapse of an entire expedition funded by Athens' dwindling treasury. In the end, fear of reprisal kept them at their benches, but the lesson rang clear. No trireme could sail without willing hands. Carthage faced an even deadlier equation. Their rowers were mercenaries, men who pulled oars for gold, not glory. When payments lagged after the First Punic War, these hired crews didn't just grumble, they turned their ships into floating fortresses of rebellion. The mercenary war that followed saw Carthaginian admirals fighting their own navy, with mutineers commandeering vessels to blockade the very cities that had employed them. The chaos grew so severe that Rome, fresh from defeating Carthage at sea, hesitated to capitalize, fearing the contagion of revolt might spread to their own fleets. A navy built on mercenaries was a blade without a hilt, as likely to wound its wielder as its enemy. Rome learned to preempt rebellion through brutal efficiency. After the bloody revolt of the Adriatic fleet in 68 before the Common Era, Augustus overhauled naval discipline. Rowers gained regular salaries, land grants upon retirement, and most crucially, a direct line to petition the emperor. It wasn't kindness, it was cold calculation. A mutiny suppressed cost ships and prestige, but a mutiny preserved power. The Byzantine Empire later refined this further, mixing crews across ethnic lines to prevent solidarity. Greek rowers beside Armenian archers, Slav deckhands overseen by Syrian officers. Unity was dangerous. Controlled fragmentation kept admirals in charge. Yet the most fascinating mutinies were those that succeeded without violence. In 41 before the Common Era, with Octavian's fleet anchored off Brundisium, his exhausted crews simply refused to sail against Mark Antony. No drawn swords, no seized ships, just folded arms and silent defiance. Octavian, the future emperor, had no choice but to negotiate. The incident revealed a universal truth. Even the most autocratic regimes relied on the consent of those who manned the oars. What made mutinies so devastating wasn't just the loss of ships, it was the collapse of trust. A fleet that couldn't trust its crews became paralyzed, second-guessing every order. The Venetians encoded this in their naval manuals. Better a slow crew than a rebellious one, for speed can be trained, but loyalty once broken is gone forever. Centuries later, as Spanish galleons struggled with conscript revolts and the British Royal Navy faced the Nore mutiny, the pattern held. The sea cares nothing for titles or flags. It obeys only those who command both wind and will. Piracy wasn't just the scourge of ancient seas. It was the dark mirror of empire, a shadow war where thrones and thieves traded places with startling ease. The Illyrian coast, with its maze of hidden coves and jagged inlets, became the perfect nursery for pirate kings who viewed Roman grain ships as floating fortunes. These weren't mere bandits, they were entrepreneurs of chaos, demanding tribute from merchants and selling captives in Adriatic slave markets, but Rome tolerated their raids until they didn't. When an Illyrian pirate queen named Tuta arrogantly executed Roman envoys, the Republic's patience snapped. The resulting war didn't just smash pirate strongholds, it proved that no empire could thrive while predators lurked at its doorstep. Yet hypocrisy sailed these same waters. Carthage, while decrying piracy, quietly bankrolled Ligurian raiders to harass Roman supply lines during the Punic Wars. Athens turned a blind eye to Cretan pirates who disrupted Spartan allies until those same pirates began preying on Athenian vessels. The line between state-sponsored privateer and outlaw was often just a parchment-thin letter of marque. Even Pompey the Great, celebrated for cleansing the Mediterranean of pirates in 67 before the Common Era, first rose to prominence by employing ex-pirates as naval scouts. The game was clear. Piracy was a crime when done to you, but a tactic when done for you. Rhodes stood apart, building its entire identity around anti-piracy patrols. Their sleek penteconters, crewed by volunteers who earned citizenship through service, became the Coast Guard of the ancient world. Rhodes didn't just chase pirates, they studied them, creating the first known maritime insurance system where merchants pooled funds to ransom captured ships. Their lighthouse wasn't just a navigational aid, it was a symbol that commerce would outlast predation. When earthquakes toppled Rhodes' defenses in 227 before the Common Era, every trading power from Egypt to Pontus sent aid, proof that protecting the seas was everyone's business. The most fascinating pirates were those who traded cutlasses for titles. The Cilician pirate chief Diomes went from plundering Roman villas to commanding a squadron under Pompey, his knowledge of hidden coves repurposed for imperial patrols. Similarly, the Viking Rollo transitioned from raiding Frankish coasts to founding Normandy as a duke. These weren't just redemption stories. They were pragmatic mergers where empires absorbed the very threats they couldn't eliminate. Centuries later, the echoes of these ancient struggles persist. The Barbary corsairs who bedeviled European shipping until the 19th century were heirs to Illyrian tactics, while modern navies still grapple with Somali pirates using methods Rhodes would recognize instantly. The lesson written in saltwater and blood remains unchanged. The sea has always had room for both crowns and cutthroats, and the balance between them shapes the fate of nations. Amphibious warfare wasn't just about landing troops, it was about rewriting the rules of engagement. Picture the Athenian siege of Syracuse in 415 before the Common Era. A fleet of over 100 triremes disgorging thousands of hoplites onto Sicilian shores, their success hinging on the precise choreography of oarsmen and soldiers. But the real brilliance lay in what happened next. Instead of scattering to pillage, the Athenians immediately fortified their beachhead, transforming the shoreline into a fortified depot where ships could resupply while their army pushed inland. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a mobile colony, a bridgehead where sea power and land power fused into something unstoppable, at least in theory. Because when the Syracusans counterattacked, burning Athenian supply ships and severing that lifeline, the lesson became brutally clear. Amphibious assaults were only as strong as their logistics. Rome elevated this art to near perfection during their conquest of Britain. When Claudius's legions landed in 43 of the Common Era, they didn't just wade ashore, they brought prefabricated forts, siege engines disassembled into ship-friendly bundles, and even a floating harbor made of lashed-together barges. The genius was in the details. Roman ships carried special landing craft with drop-down ramps, allowing cavalry to charge directly onto beaches without losing formation. Their navy didn't just transport the army, it became an extension of it, with warships providing covering fire from ballistae mounted on decks while marines secured the flanks. This wasn't just coordination, it was symbiosis, where every oar stroke and legionary step was part of a single devastating machine. Yet for every success, there were spectacular failures that revealed the razor's edge of amphibious warfare. The Persians learned this the hard way during their invasion of Greece. At Marathon in 490 before the Common Era, their fleet landed a massive force only to watch it get trapped on the beach by Athenian hoplites who'd rushed to intercept them. Without room to maneuver or cavalry support properly deployed, the Persians' numerical advantage meant nothing. The sea had given them mobility, but the land demanded tactics they hadn't prepared for. Centuries later, the Vikings would flip this script, their shallow draft longships allowing lightning raids where they controlled both the landing and the retreat, turning the coastline into a revolving door of terror. What separated the masters from the doomed was adaptability. When Caesar invaded Britain in 55 before the Common Era, his first attempt nearly collapsed storm-tossed ships, disoriented troops, and Britons who exploited every moment of chaos. But his second invasion a year later showcased Roman ingenuity, broader beaches for deployment, ships redesigned with shallower drafts, and cavalry held in reserve until the infantry had secured the shore. It was a blueprint for future conquests, proving that amphibious power wasn't about the initial landing but the ability to sustain and reinforce it. The psychological impact of these operations often outweighed their physical toll. Nothing shattered an enemy's morale like seeing warships materialize on their unprotected coastline, an arena where they'd never prepared to fight. When Alexander the Great besieged Tyre in 332 before the Common Era, he didn't just build a causeway, he turned his entire army into a navy, mounting siege towers on ships to assault the island fortress from all sides at once. The message was unmistakable. No place was safe, not even behind walls surrounded by water. Modern militaries still study these ancient campaigns because the core challenges remain unchanged. The D-Day landings of World War II echoed the same principles as Rome's British invasion. Control the beaches, protect the supply lines, and never let the enemy recover from the shock of your arrival. From the Athenian disaster at Syracuse to the Normandy triumph, one truth endures. Amphibious warfare is the ultimate test of an empire's reach, where victory goes not to the strongest army or the mightiest fleet, but to those who can make them dance as one. Athens' Sicilian disaster wasn't just a lost battle. It was the moment the tide of history turned against naval supremacy. Picture the aftermath: 200 triremes reduced to charred wreckage off Syracuse's shores, 19,000 rowers dead or enslaved, and an empire's treasury drained to its last silver drachma. The real damage wasn't the loss of ships, but the unraveling of an entire system. Athenian naval dominance had been built on three pillars: silver from Laurian's mines to pay rowers, allies' tribute to fund shipyards, and the unshakable belief that their fleet was invincible. Sicily shattered all three. When the surviving crews limped home, they didn't return to heroes' welcomes but to a city questioning whether sea power was worth its staggering cost. The Peloponnesian War ground on for another decade, but Athens never fully regained its maritime edge, proof that naval empires could collapse long before their final defeat. Carthage's fate was even more deliberate. After Rome's victory in the Third Punic War, the terms of surrender included a chilling clause. Every remaining Carthaginian warship was to sail into the harbor and burned under Roman supervision. Imagine the scene: quinqueremes that had once dominated the western Mediterranean reduced to kindling, their ashes floating over a city that would soon follow them into oblivion. But Rome didn't just destroy Carthage's navy, they systematically dismantled the infrastructure behind it. Shipyards were razed, maritime trade routes reassigned to Roman allies, and even Carthaginian fishermen were forbidden to sail beyond coastal waters. This wasn't mere conquest, it was the surgical removal of a naval tradition centuries in the making. Yet the decline of these seafaring giants wasn't just about military defeat. Rome's own rise revealed a deeper truth: naval power meant little without political will to sustain it. As legions marched across Gaul and Egypt, the Senate increasingly saw fleets as expensive luxuries rather than necessities. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Rome's once formidable navy had dwindled to anti-piracy patrols, its admirals overshadowed by land-focused generals. The Mediterranean became what Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea, not through naval battles, but because no credible challenger remained. When Augustus established permanent naval bases at Misenum and Ravenna, it was less about projecting power than maintaining what historian Tacitus called a peacekeeper's modest flotilla. The Byzantine Empire later proved dominance could be regained, but at a price. Facing Arab fleets in the 7th century, Constantinople revived naval innovation with Greek fire and Droman warships. Yet this resurgence came at the cost of becoming what Athens and Carthage had been: a maritime power forced to prioritize navy over army, leaving its land borders perilously thin. The pattern repeated with Venice's rise in the Middle Ages. Their legendary arsenal could produce a warship in a single day, but their terrestrial territories remained vulnerable to any enemy who bypassed the lagoons. What makes these declines so instructive is their variety. Athens fell to overextension, Carthage to systematic eradication, Rome to complacency, and Byzantium to impossible balancing acts. Each case whispers the same warning: naval supremacy is never permanent. The same seas that lift empires up will eventually test their foundations, and only those who adapt to shifting currents survive. Modern superpowers would do well to remember that controlling the waves requires more than ships. It demands the economic resilience to build them, the political vision to deploy them, and the humility to know no dominion lasts forever. Rome didn't just defeat Carthage at sea, they rewrote the rules of naval combat with a single brutal innovation: the Corvus. Picture this: a 12-foot wooden bridge studded with iron spikes, mounted on the prow of a Roman ship. When an enemy vessel drew near, the bridge would crash down like a guillotine, its spikes embedding into the opponent's deck. Suddenly, a sea battle became a land battle, and Rome's legions could storm across like they were charging an open field. This wasn't just a tactical shift, it was a psychological masterstroke. Carthaginian crews, trained for the fluid dance of ramming and evasion, found themselves trapped in a nightmare facing armored legionaries on solid footing. The Corvus turned Rome's weakness, inexperienced sailors, into a strength, unstoppable infantry, proving that sometimes the best way to win at sea was to erase the sea entirely. But innovation never stops at one breakthrough. Centuries later, the Latin sail revolutionized naval mobility in ways the Romans could never have imagined. Unlike square sails that caught wind only from behind, this triangular wonder could pivot like a bird's wing, harnessing breezes from any angle. Arab and Byzantine ships adopted it first, their dhows and dromons slicing through the Mediterranean with uncanny precision. The Latin sail didn't just improve speed, it shattered logistical limits. Ships could now tack against the wind, navigate narrow straits, and outmaneuver bulkier opponents. When the Portuguese combined Latin sails with sturdy caravel hulls in the 15th century, they didn't just explore new worlds, they redesigned the very concept of naval reach. Yet every advantage came with trade-offs. The Corvus, for all its brute force, made Roman ships dangerously top-heavy. After 2 entire fleets capsized in storms, the device vanished from history as abruptly as it appeared, a reminder that naval innovation is a gamble where the sea always holds the final card. The Latin sail, meanwhile, demanded crews with specialized skills to manage its complex rigging. Empires that mastered it flourished, those that didn't found themselves outpaced in the race for trade routes and colonies. The most fascinating aspect of these innovations isn't just their engineering, it's how they forced adversaries into impossible choices. After encountering the Corvus, Carthage had to either abandon their superior seamanship to build heavier ships or risk annihilation by Roman boarding parties. Neither option worked. Similarly, when the Ottoman Empire clung to traditional galleys while European rivals embraced sail-powered galleons, their once dominant navy became obsolete. Naval history has no mercy for those who hesitate. What's striking is how these ancient breakthroughs mirror today's arms races. The Corvus was the ancient equivalent of stealth technology, an asymmetric game changer. The Latin sail, think of it as the shift from coal to nuclear propulsion, rewriting the rules of engagement. The lesson carved into every wave is timeless. Dominance belongs not to the strongest fleet, but to the most adaptable minds. From the spike-studded bridges of Rome to the wind-harnessing sails of Arabia, every revolution in naval warfare began with a simple question: what if we did it differently? And ended with empires rising or falling on the answer. Artemisia of Caria didn't just command ships, she defied an empire's expectations. When Xerxes invaded Greece in 480 before the Common Era, his fleet included one admiral who stood apart, a Greek-speaking queen from the coast of modern-day Turkey. While Persian nobles scoffed at taking orders from a woman, Artemisia's strategic brilliance silenced them. At Salamis, she allegedly advised Xerxes against a direct assault, recognizing the trap the Greeks had set. When he ignored her and charged into disaster, she turned retreat into legend cornered by an Athenian trireme. She ordered her own ship to ram a Persian ally, convincing pursuers she was fighting on their side. The ruse worked, and Xerxes later praised her as the only commander, with the courage of a man and the cunning of a fox. Her story shatters the myth that ancient navies were exclusively male domains, proving that when survival was at stake, talent trumped tradition. Yet for every Artemisia, countless unnamed women shaped naval history from the shadows. In Athens, where women were barred from public life, the wealthy matron Lysimache used her family's fortune to bankroll triremes during the Peloponnesian War, her donations quietly recorded in temple inscriptions. Phoenician merchant queens like Dido of Carthage didn't just rule cities, they oversaw sprawling trade networks that supplied timber, rope, and silver to shipyards. Even Spartan women, famous for their land-based autonomy, managed estates that produced the flax for sails and the iron for rams while men were at sea. These weren't passive bystanders, they were the hidden architects of maritime power, their influence flowing like undercurrents beneath the waves of history. The logistical backbone of navies often rested in women's hands. Roman military records from Ostia reveal women ran supply depots that kept fleets provisioned, negotiating with grain merchants and coordinating deliveries. In Alexandria, female scholars at the Great Library contributed to navigational advances, their astronomical charts guiding ships across the Mediterranean. And when fleets were destroyed, as at Syracuse, it was women who rebuilt them from the ground up, organizing refugee rowers and scavenging materials from ruined shipyards. Their labor rarely earned monuments, but without it, no empire could have sustained naval dominance for long. What makes these stories so revolutionary isn't just their existence, it's what they reveal about the nature of power at sea. Unlike land armies bound by rigid hierarchies, navies demanded fluid skills, diplomacy to secure ports, literacy to manage inventories, and adaptability to survive the sea's unpredictability. These were arenas where a sharp mind mattered more than brute strength, where a queen's political savvy could outmaneuver a general's sword. The Mediterranean didn't care if the hand on the tiller belonged to a king or a merchant's daughter. It rewarded those who understood its rhythms. The legacy of these women resonates far beyond antiquity. When Byzantine Empress Irene commissioned the Droman fleets that repelled Arab invasions, or when Renaissance-era Venetian women ran shipping empires from their palazzos, they stood on the shoulders of Artemisia and her forgotten peers. Their collective lesson is timeless. Naval greatness was never about who stood on the decks, but about who harnessed the winds of opportunity regardless of the world's expectations. The sea, in its ruthless impartiality, became history's most unlikely equalizer. The Athenian disaster at Sicily wasn't just a defeat, it was a slow-motion unraveling of hubris. Picture the scene, their once proud fleet, trapped in Syracuse's harbor like fish in a net, torched by fireships as desperate oarsmen leaped into water choked with wreckage. But the true tragedy wasn't the flames, it was the chain of arrogance that led there. Athens had sent its navy halfway across the Mediterranean without securing a single reliable ally in Sicily, assuming their reputation alone would intimidate the Syracusans. Instead, they found an enemy who'd studied their tactics, adapting the Athenians' own trireme maneuvers against them. The final blow came not from enemy rams, but from thirst crews stranded onshore, gulping brackish water from puddles while Syracusan cavalry picked them off. This wasn't just a lost battle, it was the moment Athens' imperial ambition hit bedrock, proving that naval power without logistical foresight was just expensive kindling. The Persians learned a harsher lesson about nature's indifference to human plans. When Xerxes' invasion fleet rounded Mount Athos in 492 before the Common Era, they faced a storm so violent it became legend. Ancient historians claimed 300 ships shattered against the cliffs, their wreckage so thick the shoreline was paved with splintered wood and drowned men. The numbers may be exaggerated, but the psychological impact was real. Persian commanders began seeing omens in every cloud, delaying campaigns for fear of divine wrath. Xerxes' response, he ordered a canal dug across the Athos Peninsula, a 3-year engineering marvel meant to cheat the storms. Yet even this couldn't save his fleet from later disasters at Salamis, where narrow straits turned numerical superiority into a death trap. The lesson etched into those drowned hulls was timeless. The sea forgives no arrogance, punishes every assumption. Rome's navy suffered its own humiliating education during the First Punic War. Their hastily built fleet, reverse-engineered from a captured Carthaginian ship, met catastrophe not in battle but in transit. A consul ignored seasoned sailors' warnings about approaching weather, insisting the untested crews push forward. The result, 100 ships sank in a single tempest, taking with them 90,000 rowers and soldiers. A loss so staggering the Senate briefly considered abandoning naval warfare entirely. What saved Rome wasn't pride, but pragmatism. They rebuilt with a focus on durability over speed, adding Corvus boarding bridges to leverage their infantry's strength. Their recovery proved disaster could be a better teacher than victory. Even the mighty Byzantines faced moments of maritime humiliation. In 907, a ruse Viking fleet sailed straight into Constantinople's harbor, bypassing the legendary chain defenses because complacent guards hadn't raised it. The invaders burned entire naval squadrons at anchor, their flames reflected in the Golden Horn's waters. Emperor Leo VI's subsequent naval manuals didn't just prescribe tactics, they drilled paranoia, emphasizing that vigilance mattered more than any technology. These disasters share an uncomfortable truth: naval supremacy is always provisional. A fleet that ruled the waves one season could become a seabed graveyard the next, undone by storms, arrogance, or sheer bad luck. The Phoenicians, who dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries, saw their ports silt up from deforestation-induced erosion, their ships slowly stranded by the very land they'd neglected. For every admiral who mastered the sea's surface, there were countless others who learned too late that the depths keep their own counsel. The wrecks littering ancient coastlines aren't just relics, they're warnings whispering that the ocean tolerates no masters, only temporary guests. The echoes of ancient naval warfare didn't fade with the last trireme. They rippled through centuries, shaping the strategies of empires yet to rise. Venice, that glittering jewel of the Adriatic, didn't just inherit the Mediterranean's trade routes, it mastered the Carthaginian playbook of economic warfare. Their naval dominance wasn't built on brute force but on chokehold blockades that starved rivals of grain and gold, mirroring Athens' stranglehold on the Delian League. Even their famed arsenal, where ships could be mass-produced in days, owed its efficiency to Roman-style prefabrication techniques rediscovered a millennium later. The Venetians understood what the ancients knew: control the sea's pulse, its trade winds and tidal currents, and you controlled destiny itself. Half a world away, the British Empire would perfect these lessons on a global scale. Nelson's victory at Trafalgar wasn't just a triumph of cannon fire. It was the culmination of tactics honed since Salamis. His famous crossing the T maneuver, cutting perpendicular through enemy lines to unleash broadsides, echoed the Greek Deiplos, shattering formations through precision rather than numbers. Even the Royal Navy's blockade of Napoleonic France followed the same ruthless logic as Rome's siege of Carthage. Why risk battle when starvation could do the work for you? The British didn't just borrow ancient strategies, they industrialized them, turning the Mediterranean's chess game into a planet-sized tableau. Modern naval intelligence operations trace their roots to these early innovators. The Byzantine cryptoi, spies who monitored ship movements from coastal watchtowers, would recognize today's satellite surveillance. Rhodes' anti-piracy networks, with their coded signal fires, foreshadowed the encrypted communications of nuclear submarines. And the psychological warfare waged by admirals like Themistocles, using misinformation to lure enemies into traps, finds its parallel in electronic deception and cyber operations. The tools have evolved, but the goal remains unchanged: see first, strike decisively. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in amphibious warfare. When Allied forces stormed Normandy's beaches in 1944, they weren't just repeating Caesar's invasion of Britain, they were perfecting it. Prefabricated Mulberry harbors mirrored Rome's floating docks, while airborne pathfinders lighting landing zones recreated the beacon fires used by Alexander's scouts. The ancient world's hardest lesson, that logistics make or break invasions, became the cornerstone of D-Day's success. Even today, aircraft carriers function as mobile versions of Athens' fortified beachheads, projecting power far beyond their hulls. What these threads reveal is a truth as deep as the ocean. Naval power isn't about ships or weapons, but about the ideas that animate them. The Triremes ram taught the importance of speed and precision, lessons etched into the hulls of destroyers. The Venetian arsenal's efficiency lives on in modular shipbuilding, and the mercenary rowers of Carthage remind us that loyalty, not just technology, fuels empires. From the laser-guided missiles of today to the flaming arrows of antiquity, one principle endures: mastery of the sea isn't won, it's inherited, adapted, and earned anew with each passing tide. The ancient admirals may be dust, but their strategies still sail with every fleet that cuts through the waves. Ancient naval warfare wasn't just about battles, it was a laboratory of human ingenuity, where every wave carried a lesson in survival and ambition. Think of the trireme, that slender Greek masterpiece. As more than a warship, it was a floating revolution. Its 3 tiers of rowers didn't just power through water, they powered the rise of democracy, proving that collective effort could outmuscle even the mightiest tyrants. And then there's Greek fire, Byzantium's closely guarded secret, a weapon so terrifying it turned the sea itself into an ally. These weren't just tools of war, they were declarations that dominance required both brilliance and ruthlessness in equal measure. But the true legacy of these ancient struggles isn't just in the ships or the tactics, it's in the way they reshaped the world's map. Carthage might have fallen, but its mercantile DNA lives on in every modern navy that blends trade with military might. Rome's mastery of logistics birthed the blueprint for empires that followed, where supply lines became as vital as battle lines. Even the smallest innovations, like the Rhodian anti-piracy patrols, taught us that security and prosperity are 2 sides of the same coin. What's startling is how these ancient echoes still ripple through modern conflicts. The blockade strategies used to starve Carthage, they've evolved into today's economic sanctions, where cutting off trade can topple regimes without firing a shot. The psychological warfare of Themistocles, spinning lies to bait enemies into traps, finds its counterpart in digital disinformation campaigns. And just as the Phoenicians tied their fate to controlling key straits, modern superpowers jockey for dominance over choke points like the Strait of Hormuz or the South China Sea. The players have changed, but the game remains eerily familiar. So why does this matter now? Because the sea hasn't forgotten its old lessons. Those who ignore the delicate balance of power, who underestimate the importance of logistics or allies, often meet the same fates as Athens at Syracuse or Persia at Salamis. The ocean doesn't care about flags or ideologies. It rewards those who respect its rhythms and punishes those who don't. As we close this voyage through history, remember, the past isn't just a story. It's a mirror. Whether it's a trireme's ram or a drone's precision strike, the principles of naval power remain timeless. Adaptation wins, preparation saves. And above all, the sea favors no one, but it listens to those who learn its language. If these tales of strategy and survival resonated with you, join the conversation below. What ancient naval lesson do you think still holds the most weight today? Hit like, subscribe, and let's keep decoding history's hidden currents together. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.